On the 5th of April, 1933, the United States government enacted a prohibition on American citizens possessing gold. Within a span of 10 months, authorities had commandeered over 300 tons of privately held gold, subsequently revaluing the national currency. This action effectively transferred billions of dollars in wealth from individuals to the Federal Reserve System. This was not characterized as theft, but rather as a deliberate monetary policy. What should particularly capture your attention is that the very framework employed to reshape our monetary system in 1933 is currently being reconstituted, utilizing digital technologies that render the original approach antiquated. Let us revisit the origin of this recurring pattern, as understanding past events illuminates the present construction. Visualize this scene. The 9th of March, 1933, in Washington, D.C. President Franklin Roosevelt had occupied the office for a mere 5 days. Every financial institution across the nation was suspended under an emergency decree. At the Federal Reserve Board building on Constitution Avenue, representatives from the New York Federal Reserve Bank and the Treasury Department convened around elaborately polished tables laden with ledgers detailing bank reserves. Their objective was to devise the blueprint for the most significant monetary realignment in American history. The challenge they sought to resolve was gold, specifically the $4,220 million held by American citizens in gold coins and certificates. While the money supply was severely constricting the economy, the Federal Reserve, established just 20 years prior in 1913, was unable to expand credit because each dollar was required to be backed by gold under the Gold Standard Act of 1900. The plan they formulated that week would permanently alter the relationship between the American populace, currency, and the state. Executive Order 6002, signed on the 5th of April, 1933, mandated that all individuals surrender gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve by the 1st of May, 1933. You were afforded 26 days to comply. The directive stipulated a sale at the official rate of $20.67 per troy ounce. Non-compliance carried a penalty of $10,000, equivalent to $230,000 in contemporary currency, or a 10-year sentence in federal prison. Reflect on the circumstances faced by your grandparents that spring: a knock at the door, a governmental notice demanding the relinquishment of gold that families might have amassed over generations. In return, they received paper Federal Reserve notes, essentially exchanging tangible gold for government promissory notes, underpinned by nothing more than the very institution that insisted on confiscating their gold. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York processed 3,605 tons of gold between April and December of 1933. This represented approximately 116 million troy ounces flowing from American citizens into federal depositories. According to Federal Reserve records, this transfer constituted the most substantial peacetime confiscation of wealth in the nation's history up to that point. However, the true mechanism becomes clearer when examining the subsequent financial maneuvers. The Gold Reserve Act of 1934, enacted on January 30th, finalized the realignment. It transferred all monetary gold from the 12 Federal Reserve banks to the U.S. Treasury. Section 12 of this act achieved a remarkable feat. It revalued gold from $20.67 to $35 per ounce, a staggering 69% increase implemented overnight. This was not a market fluctuation. Congress simply decreed a higher dollar value for gold. To provide perspective, an individual who surrendered 100 ounces of gold in May of 1933 would have received $2,670 in Federal Reserve notes. By February of 1934, that identical quantity of gold officially supported $3,500 in currency. The disparity, $1,433, was absorbed by the Federal Reserve System and the Treasury Department. Now multiply this by the 300 tons of confiscated gold. The government effectively seized approximately $3 billion in purchasing power. In today's terms, this is equivalent to $69 billion in the year 2025, achieved without generating any new economic value. The Federal Reserve's gold certificates, suddenly valued at $35 per ounce instead of $20.67, generated $2.8 billion in new paper value on the Fed's balance sheet. The Exchange Stabilization Fund, established by this same act, received $2 billion from this windfall. That fund remains operational today, granting Treasury officials perpetual authority to intervene in foreign exchange markets under Title 31, Section 5302 of the United States Code. Have you begun to discern the pattern? Because what I am about to reveal is the blueprint that is repeatedly employed whenever our monetary system necessitates reconstruction. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, holding our most substantial gold reserves, observed an expansion of its balance sheet by $1.2 billion without extending any loans, financing any industrial ventures, or contributing to any employment. The institution that compelled citizens to surrender gold at $20.67 per ounce witnessed that same gold revalued to $35 per ounce on its own books just 10 months later. Your great-grandparents experienced a 41% reduction in their purchasing power overnight. The Federal Reserve gained $2.8 billion in new lending capacity. The wealth did not vanish. It merely changed custodians from the citizenry to institutions through the force of legal decree. And here is a crucial detail most individuals overlook regarding 1933. This was not the United States government's inaugural monetary realignment. Congress had previously revalued silver against gold on multiple occasions between 1792 and 1900. However, the sequence from 1933 to 1934 established the contemporary model, the one that holds significance for what is impending. This mechanism did not necessitate hyperinflation, economic collapse, or foreign invasion. It required solely legal authority operating within an atmosphere of crisis. The Emergency Banking Act, passed on March 9, 1933, conferred these powers upon the president following a mere 8 hours of congressional deliberation. Consider that time frame. 8 hours of debate to authorize the restructuring of our entire monetary framework, the entire realignment from the closure of banks to the revaluation of gold, took 10 months. What does this reveal about the actual workings of our monetary system? Central banking authorities demonstrated their capacity to freeze the existing system through emergency powers, seize existing forms of currency via executive order, revalue monetary units through legislative action, recapitalize central bank balance sheets through accounting entries, and shift purchasing power from citizens to institutions by exploiting the mathematical differential between the confiscation price and the revaluation price. The legal underpinnings for this process originated from the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. Originally enacted to regulate financial transactions with hostile nations during the First World War, Roosevelt's administration repurposed a wartime statute to reshape peacetime monetary arrangements. That same statute, though amended, remains active in the United States Code today under Title 50, Section 4305. A quick test. What transpires when the entities controlling currency issuance need to restructure the system once more? What occurs when our present monetary architecture, built upon debt and derivatives, demands a similar reset to that which gold required in 1933? The template is in place. The legal authority persists on the books. The established pattern is already set. Your great-grandparents who held gold in 1933 believed their wealth was secure. Gold had served as money for millennia. Then, within 10 months, executive decrees and legislative enactments fundamentally altered the very basis of monetary value in our country. The wealth did not disappear. The purchasing power did not evaporate. It was transferred from the citizenry to the Federal Reserve System through legal mechanisms that, while appearing mundane, proved devastatingly effective. And if you believe this was a singular event confined to the Great Depression, I must demonstrate what followed. For the 1933 to 1934, realignment was not the conclusion of this pattern, it was its inception. The mechanism I have just described was not unique to 1933. What if I were to tell you that this same template has been employed repeatedly, each instance transferring wealth from those holding legacy monetary assets to institutions that control newer ones? Allow me to guide you through the framework that consistently reappears across different historical periods. Every monetary realignment adheres to a consistent pattern comprising 5 technical components. Once you recognize this structure, you will observe its operation within our current financial system. Component 1. Legal foundation. Every realignment commences with legal authority already present in our statute books, awaiting activation during a crisis. The Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917 initially passed to regulate financial dealings with adversarial nations, provided Roosevelt with the statutory basis for Executive Order 6002. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913, specifically Section 14, granted the Fed the authority to acquire government securities. This laid the groundwork for quantitative easing nearly a century later. The Gold Reserve Act of 1934 established the Exchange Stabilization Fund under what is now Title 31, Section 5302, vesting the Treasury Secretary with perpetual power to engage in transactions involving gold, foreign exchange, and other credit instruments without requiring congressional approval for each individual transaction. These laws remain active in the year 2025. They are not mere historical relics, but potent instruments within legal arsenals. Component 2. Asset redenomination. This is where the financial intricacies become fascinating, as the core mechanism involves altering the relationship between existing assets and monetary units. When gold was revalued from $20.67 to $35 per ounce in 1934, the physical gold remained unchanged. It was the unit of measurement that shifted. Let me illustrate how this evolved into a global framework. On July 22, 1944, at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, representatives from 44 nations convened to establish the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The United States delegation, led by Treasury official Harry Dexter White, negotiated from a position of overwhelming strength. We possessed 574 million troy ounces of gold, valued at approximately $20 billion at $35 per ounce, representing 59% of global official gold reserves according to Federal Reserve data. The Bretton Woods Agreement pegged gold at $35 per ounce while instituting other currencies at fixed exchange rates relative to our dollar. The British pound at $4.30, the French franc at 1,119 thousandths of a dollar. This created a hierarchical structure with the dollar at its apex, rendering all other currencies reliant on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. The Articles of Agreement of the IMF, specifically Article 4, Section 1, codified this arrangement. Consider the implications for the rest of the world. Every Deutsche Mark in West Germany, every yen in Japan, every lira in Italy, their value now depended on the US dollar, maintaining its convertibility to gold. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York became the primary clearinghouse for international transactions. This system functioned exceptionally well until its eventual breakdown. Component 3. Unilateral revaluation. This is the scenario where a nation holding reserve currency status can unilaterally reshape global monetary arrangements through executive decision. On August 15, 1971, at Camp David, President Nixon, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, and Treasury Secretary John Connally made a decision that Sunday afternoon that would define modern monetary mechanics for the subsequent 50 years. That evening, Nixon appeared on television to announce that the dollar would no longer be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce, effectively closing the gold window. Here are the financial realities that necessitated this decision. Foreign central banks held approximately $50 billion in reserves, ostensibly backed by the gold reserves at Fort Knox. At $35 per ounce, this represented a claim on 1.43 billion ounces of gold. However, the Federal Reserve's actual gold holdings in August 1971 amounted to 276 million ounces, valued at $9.7 billion. We had generated $40 billion more in dollar liabilities than our gold assets could possibly support. The expenditures for the Vietnam War, Great Society programs, and the expanding global usage of the dollar all contributed to the creation of dollars that theoretically converted to gold. The Smithsonian Agreement, signed on December 18, 1971, attempted to salvage the system by revaluing gold to $38 per ounce and subsequently to $42.20 per ounce by February 1973 under the Par Value Modification Act. However, the financial equation was already fundamentally flawed. By March 1973, the system had completely collapsed, giving way to floating exchange rates. Now, observe the impact on wealth distribution. Foreign central banks holding dollar reserves saw their option for gold convertibility disappear overnight. The Bank for International Settlements reported that international dollar reserves, if theoretically converted at the new rates, would now claim progressively less gold. First 1.32 billion ounces, then 1.18 billion ounces. The Federal Reserve's gold position effectively improved by 300 million ounces of liabilities, valued at $12.66 billion, without relinquishing a single gold bar. The Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund recorded a $1.4 billion profit from official gold revaluation added to the fund's balance sheet in fiscal year 1972, according to Treasury Department records. Have you noticed what just transpired? Our government reconfigured the global monetary system, eliminated the gold constraint on dollar creation, and captured billions in value. All of this was achieved through weekend meetings at Camp David and executive pronouncements without any congressional declaration of war, constitutional amendment, or public referendum. The Federal Reserve gained the unrestricted ability to create dollars without the backing of gold. Every dollar held by foreign governments and citizens was suddenly backed by nothing other than the Federal Reserve's assurance and the military's capacity to enforce dollar acceptance for oil transactions. This leads us to Component 4, coordinated intervention. Sometimes, monetary realignments necessitate international cooperation to redistribute currency values. On September 22, 1985, at the Plaza Hotel in New York, finance ministers from the G5 nations, the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, signed an agreement to depreciate the US dollar against the yen and the Deutsche Mark. This was not a result of market forces. It was orchestrated central bank intervention. Between September 1985 and May 1986, the Bank of Japan engaged in interventions totaling $37 billion in dollar-yen transactions. The Bundesbank expended $17 billion on dollar mark operations. The dollar depreciated by 46% against the yen, falling from 242 yen to 128 yen per dollar, and by 35% against the mark, declining from 2.94 Deutsche Marks to 1.91 Deutsche Marks within 2 years. Let me illustrate who benefited and who bore the cost. U.S. exporters gained price competitiveness. Our products became 30 to 40% cheaper in foreign markets. The Federal Reserve reduced the real value of dollar-denominated U.S. debt held by foreign creditors. We owed approximately $300 billion in Treasury securities to foreign holders. That debt effectively became 30 to 40% cheaper in yen and mark terms. Japanese and German citizens holding dollar assets experienced a loss of purchasing power overnight. The Bank of Japan's $37 billion intervention when the dollar fell from 242 yen to 128 yen represented an unrealized loss of approximately $17 billion on the bank's foreign exchange reserves, according to Bank of Japan balance sheet data. You are now beginning to recognize the pattern, aren't you? Each realignment leverages existing legal authority to redefine the monetary reference point and transfer purchasing power from holders of existing assets to institutions that control new issuances. Component 5. Balance sheet expansion as a policy tool. This represents the modern evolution and is the critical link connecting historical realignments to the infrastructure currently being assembled. On March 11, 2020, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet stood at $4.24 trillion. By April 2022, a mere 25 months later, it had surged to $8.96 trillion, an increase of $4.72 trillion, exceeding the entire economy of Germany. The Federal Open Market Committee's statement on March 15, 2020, authorized the purchase of at least $500 billion in Treasury securities and at least $200 billion in mortgage-backed securities. However, this evolved within weeks to monthly purchases of $120 billion with no specified end date. The primary market corporate credit facility and the secondary market corporate credit facility, established on March 23, 2020, permitted the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to acquire $13.7 billion in corporate bonds and ETFs by December 2020. The Municipal Liquidity Facility added $6.66 billion in loans to state and local governments. Consider the practical implications of this. The balance sheet expansion generated $4.72 trillion in new Federal Reserve liabilities, designated as bank reserves, backed by Treasury securities and mortgage bonds. Commercial banks holding these reserves gained substantial lending capacity. The Treasury Department, financing $6.66 trillion in COVID relief spending between March 2020 and December 2021, found a willing purchaser for its debt at near zero interest rates. And who bore the cost of this expansion? Savers holding dollars in March 2020 witnessed consumer price index inflation reach 9.1% by June 2022, the most rapid decline in purchasing power since 1981, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics data. Your savings accounts, your fixed pensions, your salaries that remained stagnant for 2 years, all lost 15 to 20% of their purchasing power, while the Federal Reserve's balance sheet doubled. It is the identical template from 1933, merely with different mechanisms. In 1933, the government confiscated and revalued gold. In 2020 to 2022, the Federal Reserve purchased assets and devalued the dollar through inflation. The beneficiaries shifted from the Fed's gold holdings to the reserve positions of commercial banks, but the mathematical outcome of wealth transfer remained precisely the same. Each realignment in our history follows this framework. Utilize pre-existing legal authority, restructure the monetary reference point through executive or central bank action, recapitalize banking institutions via accounting adjustments, and transfer wealth from citizens holding cash and fixed income assets to institutions positioned within the new system. The beneficiaries consistently include those associated with central banking institutions or holding assets that appreciate under the new framework. Conversely, the losers consistently comprise those holding cash, fixed deposits, bonds, or any asset denominated in the devalued currency. In 1933, citizens holding gold lost to the Federal Reserve's revalued balance sheet. In 1971, foreign governments holding dollars lost to the Federal Reserve's unlimited issuance capacity. In 1985, Japanese savers holding dollars lost to coordinated currency intervention. In 2020 to 2022, American savers holding cash lost to quantitative easing and inflation. The mechanisms differ, the justifications vary, and the crisis atmospheres are distinct, but the mathematical outcomes are identical. Purchasing power flows from dispersed holders of legacy monetary assets to concentrated controllers of new monetary issuance. And now, in the year 2025, the infrastructure for the next realignment is under construction. However, this time, the underlying technology enables something that the architects of 1933 could never have envisioned. A monetary system where every transaction is logged, every dollar can be programmed, and negative interest rates can be applied directly to your savings without the need for physical confiscation of any assets. Let me elucidate precisely what is being constructed while public attention is diverted by stock market fluctuations and political theatrics. As of 2024, according to the Atlantic Council's Central Bank Digital Currency Tracker, 108 countries, representing 95% of global GDP, are actively exploring central bank digital currencies. This is not a coincidence. It represents coordinated infrastructure development for the next monetary realignment. And the framework being assembled today makes the gold confiscation of 1933 appear rudimentary. Let me begin by explaining what transpired during the COVID-19 pandemic, as it clearly illustrates why central banks require this new system. The events of March 2020 exposed a critical deficiency in our current monetary architecture. The Federal Reserve possesses the capacity to create trillions in bank reserves, but it cannot directly disburse funds to citizens. It relies on commercial banks as intermediaries and Congress to authorize fiscal spending, with the IRS processing payments. This entire process is sluggish, inefficient, and results in billions in emergency stimulus funds remaining in bank accounts rather than circulating through the economy. The COVID-19 response demonstrated both the power and the limitations of balance sheet expansion. The Federal Reserve created $4.72 trillion in new reserves over a 25-month period. However, consumer spending did not rebound until Treasury Department stimulus checks reached households months later. Based on analyses conducted by economists at the Federal Reserve, an estimated $2.3 trillion in surplus savings accumulated in bank accounts between the years 2020 and 2021. This surge occurred because individuals received funds they were unable to spend due to widespread lockdowns. Central banks are closely observing this inefficiency and have identified a potential solution: eliminating intermediaries. The proposed approach involves creating digital currencies that would be directly deposited into citizens' accounts. These digital funds could be programmed to expire if not utilized within a specific time frame, thereby generating precise transaction data essential for monetary policy adjustments. The Bank for International Settlements, with its headquarters in Basel, Switzerland, established an innovation hub in 2019 with the express purpose of investigating central bank digital currency (CBDC) technology. This institution, often referred to as the Central Bank for Central Banks, is currently orchestrating the global development of digital currencies. Project Dunbar, a collaborative effort undertaken between November 2021 and March 2022, involved the Reserve Bank of Australia, Bank Negara Malaysia, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and the South African Reserve Bank. This project tested a multi-CBDC platform designed for cross-border transactions. The developed prototype demonstrated the capability to process international payments in mere seconds, a significant improvement over the 2 to 3 days typically required for conventional SWIFT transfers. Consider the profound implications of this advancement. The very infrastructure that currently underpins the dominance of the US dollar in international trade, correspondent banking relationships, SWIFT messaging, and settlement delays necessitating dollar liquidity would become obsolete. In August 2020, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston initiated a partnership with MIT's Digital Currency Initiative to develop Project Hamilton, focusing on researching the technical prerequisites for a CBDC. Their findings, published in February 2022, showcased a system capable of processing 1.7 million transactions per second. For context, Visa, a major credit card company, handles approximately 65,000 transactions per second at its peak operational capacity. In January 2022, the Federal Reserve Board released a discussion paper titled "Money and Payments: The US Dollar in the Age of Digital Transformation." This paper outlined potential features of a CBDC without committing to its issuance. However, what should truly capture your attention is that the necessary infrastructure is being built regardless. On July 20th, 2023, the Federal Reserve unveiled its FedNow service, a platform that facilitates instant payment settlements between financial institutions, operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. By December 2024, 900 financial institutions had enrolled in this service, according to data from the Federal Reserve. While FedNow is not itself a CBDC and is presented as an enhancement to our existing payment system, it fundamentally represents the architectural foundation upon which a digital dollar would operate. This is akin to installing electrical wiring throughout a residence before introducing the appliances that will connect to it. Would you like to witness a practical demonstration of this concept? Allow me to present a working model. China's digital yuan, known as the eCNY, commenced pilot programs in Shenzhen, Suzhou, Chengdu, and Zhongyan in April 2020. By October 2023, Reports from the People's Bank of China indicated that cumulative ECNY transactions had reached 1.8 trillion yuan. This translates to 249 billion yuan distributed across 950 million individual transactions. However, the sheer volume of transactions is not the most crucial aspect. It is the features that truly reveal the potential. Consider programmable currency. During the distribution of COVID stimulus payments, the Chinese government issued digital yuan that were programmed to expire if not spent by designated dates. These funds could not be saved or invested. They had to be used for consumption within the stipulated time frame, failing which they would simply vanish from the account. Research from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York suggests that this feature boosted consumer spending by 30 to 40% compared to traditional stimulus measures, as individuals were unable to hoard the funds. Furthermore, consider transaction tracking. Every movement of the ECNY is meticulously recorded on the ledgers of the People's Bank of China. Each purchase, each transfer, and each transaction generates a distinct data point. Consequently, the government possesses comprehensive knowledge of what you purchase, when you make the purchase, where you make it, and with whom you are transacting. In stark contrast, cash transactions are inherently anonymous, whereas digital currency transactions facilitate direct surveillance. The government deposits stimulus funds directly into citizens' digital wallets, completely bypassing commercial banks. This eliminates delays associated with congressional appropriations, check processing, and the requirement for traditional bank accounts. In essence, the central bank establishes a direct relationship with every individual citizen. In June 2024, China launched the mBridge platform, which interconnects the digital yuan with digital currencies issued by the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Bank of Thailand, and the Central Bank of the United Arab Emirates. This system processed $22 billion in cross-border transactions over a testing period of 6 months. According to data from the Bank for International Settlements, this architecture effectively eradicates the correspondent banking relationships that currently bolster the dominance of the US dollar in global trade. Have you considered the ramifications of this for our monetary system? If you hold US dollars as this transition unfolds, it is imperative to understand precisely who stands to gain and who stands to lose. The beneficiaries include central banks, which will establish direct relationships with citizens, acquire perfect transaction data for monetary policy formulation, and gain the capacity to implement negative interest rates on retail holdings. The Federal Reserve, for instance, would acquire tools currently rendered impossible by the existence of physical cash. Imagine your savings account balance diminishing by 2% annually, not due to inflation, but through direct deduction. The European Central Bank's deposit facility rate reached negative 0.5% between September 2019 and July 2022, effectively imposing a tax on bank reserves. Retail CBDCs could directly tax your savings, echoing the playbook of 1933, but in a digital and continuous manner rather than a one-time event. Treasury departments will benefit from reduced borrowing costs through direct monetization, the ability to implement fiscal policy without relying on commercial bank intermediaries, and a decrease in transaction costs. This eliminates expenses associated with printing, armored transport, and vault storage, replacing them with mere database entries. Large commercial banks stand to gain as early integration partners for CBDCs. Institutions such as JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Citigroup are already participating in Federal Reserve pilot programs, positioning themselves to secure contracts for technical infrastructure. They will retain their payment processing duopoly under the new digital architecture. The financial surveillance apparatus will achieve comprehensive visibility. FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, currently mandates that banks report transactions exceeding $10,000 under the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970. With the advent of CBDCs, this reporting threshold will become obsolete. Every transaction will automatically generate a record, regardless of whether it amounts to $10,000 or $10. Now let me outline who will be on the losing end, as this mirrors the 1933 scenario. With digital precision, holders of cash will forfeit their ability to circumvent negative interest rates. While physical currency allows for cash withdrawals and private storage, digital currency effectively traps your savings within the system. The central bank will possess the capability to program your money to decrease in value on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. Escape from this devaluation through physical withdrawal will be impossible. Individuals prioritizing privacy will completely lose transaction anonymity. Every purchase will generate a central bank record detailing the payee, payer, amount, timestamp, and location data. According to research conducted by the Keough Institute, CBDC systems could generate 300 terabytes of transaction data daily for an economy the size of the United States. This is equivalent to uploading the entire collection of the Library of Congress every 2 days. Users of alternative currencies will face competition from CBDCs, which will be backed by legal tender laws. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York's Project Cedar, demonstrated in November 2023, achieved atomic settlement, enabling simultaneous foreign exchange and securities transactions. This capability could potentially eliminate the use cases that made decentralized cryptocurrencies appealing. When a government's digital currency settles instantly and carries legal tender status, why would businesses opt to accept Bitcoin? Developing nations will confront a bifurcated future. The Unbridged platform and similar systems pose a threat to dollar dominance. However, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, which stood at $7.4 trillion as of November 2024, according to Federal Reserve data, and the depth of the Treasury market, with $27 trillion in outstanding securities, maintain structural advantages. A digital dollar launched with instant settlement capabilities would further amplify these advantages on a global scale. But here lies the most critical mechanism, the one directly linked to the events of 1933. Programmability facilitates wealth transfer without the need for a physical confiscation. In 1933, the government required executive orders, federal agents, and criminal penalties to confiscate gold. In a CBDC system, the transfer of wealth would occur through code. Your digital dollars could be programmed to decrease in value relative to a new unit of account. Let us call it a digital dollar unit, or DDU. This devaluation could occur at whatever rate authorities deem necessary for monetary stability. The Federal Reserve could announce a restructuring wherein old digital dollars are converted into new DDUs at a rate that captures 30% of their value for system recapitalization. This would require no executive order, merely a software update. The mathematical outcome would be identical to that of 1934. Citizens holding 100,000 digital dollars would discover that their accounts now reflect 70,000 DDUs, signifying a 30% reduction in the Federal Reserve's liabilities overnight. The captured value would then be allocated to system recapitalization, mirroring the gold revaluation spread in 1934. According to a technical paper published by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston in 2022, CBDC systems possess the capability to implement monetary policy changes within seconds across all user accounts simultaneously through distributed ledger updates. In simpler terms, they can restructure your purchasing power faster than you can possibly react. What would precipitate such a reset? The same factors that triggered the 1933 restructuring: debt levels that cannot be serviced under current monetary arrangements. As of November 2024, the U.S. federal debt stands at $36 trillion, with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 124%. Net interest payments on federal debt for fiscal year 2024 reached $892 billion, according to data from the Treasury Department. This expenditure exceeds the nation's defense budget. When debt service costs surpass the government's capacity to collect taxes or issue new debt at sustainable rates, monetary authorities are presented with a choice: traditional default or monetary restructuring. Historical precedent indicates that they invariably opt for restructuring, as it is politically palatable, legally defensible, and mathematically effective. The CBDC infrastructure provides the necessary technical framework for such a restructuring. The legal authority for these actions is already established within the Federal Reserve Act, the Trading with the Enemy Act, and the statutes governing the Exchange Stabilization Fund. A crisis atmosphere will inevitably emerge from whatever shock impacts the system next, be it a financial crisis, a geopolitical event, a pandemic, or a cyber attack. The specific trigger is secondary. The response mechanism is already in place. Let me draw a direct parallel to April 5th, 1933, because the analogy is exact. On that date, the U.S. government outlawed gold ownership, confiscated billions in private wealth, and fundamentally restructured our monetary system. Citizens who complied lost 41% of their purchasing power when gold was revalued. The Federal Reserve, in turn, gained $2.8 billion in balance sheet capacity. In 2025, 108 countries, representing 95% of global GDP, are actively developing digital currency infrastructure. This infrastructure enables the technical implementation of negative interest rates, expiring money, programmable restrictions, and granular transaction-level control. This system is not hypothetical. China is processing $249 billion in transactions, and the Federal Reserve is testing platforms capable of handling 1.7 million transactions per second. The Bank for International Settlements is coordinating cross-border integration efforts. The underlying mechanism has remained unchanged since 1933. Only the technology executing it has evolved. The pattern involves utilizing a crisis to justify emergency powers, restructuring the monetary system, recapitalizing central banking institutions, and transferring purchasing power from citizens to institutions through the mathematical differential between old and new unit values. Your great-grandparents who held gold in 1933 believed their wealth was secure until executive orders redefined the very meaning of money. In 2025, you may be holding digital dollars under the assumption that your wealth is secure. However, the same institutions that orchestrated the restructuring of the gold standard are now building the infrastructure for the next reset. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expansion in 1934 was not an act of theft, nor will the forthcoming digital transition be. It will be monetary policy, just as it was in 1933, 1971, and 2020. The template remains the same, the technology is new, and the underlying mathematics are identical. The key difference this time is that the reset can occur at the speed of software rather than the speed of physical gold confiscation. When the next restructuring occurs, and the debt mathematics strongly suggest it must, the institutions controlling the new digital system will capture the value that holders of old system dollars lose. The infrastructure is currently being installed. The legal authority resides dormant within federal statutes. The crisis trigger will emerge when debt service costs or systemic instability necessitate monetary restructuring. History may not repeat itself, but the mathematics of monetary resets remain constant. Purchasing power flows from distributed holders of old money to concentrated controllers of new money. In 1933, this meant a transfer from citizens to the Federal Reserve. In 2028, this could represent a transfer from digital dollar holders to the controllers of the digital dollar unit. The architecture itself reveals the endgame. Whether you position yourself to survive or to thrive hinges on your ability to recognize this pattern before the next reset is executed. Your great-grandparents did not anticipate the 1933 confiscation. You are currently witnessing the construction of the 2028 infrastructure in real time. The question is not whether monetary restructuring will occur. The debt mathematics render it inevitable. The pertinent question is whether you will recognize the pattern before your purchasing power is transferred to the institutions controlling the new system, just as it was in 1933, just as it was in 1971, and just as it invariably happens when the established template repeats.